Hey guys, today we are in the book of Genesis, chapter 5. Now, if you've already read, you're probably like, what in the world can you say about this chapter? It's basically you're just reading a family tree. Of course, everything is useful. Some things you kind of wonder why it's there, but it is important because it gives us the time reference of what's happening. So let's just kind of fill in some questions that you might have. Notice in verse 4, it says the days of Adam after he followed Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days of Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. So Adam, from the day of creation to the day of his death, were 930 years. And so he had, of course, Seth, and it says he also had many other sons and daughters. So the world was populated by incest. There's no other way that you can figure it out. Everybody was related. Everybody had the same mom and dad. After a while, after a couple generations, of course, there'd have been different moms and dad, but they all went back to Adam and Eve. And the question probably becomes for a lot of people is like, why would God do that? The answer is, how else would the world be populated? I know today incest is against the law. It's frowned upon. Even in the Bible, we will see as we continue to read in the book of Leviticus and in the book of Exodus that we get the law from God that incest is wrong. But at this point, incest is not against God's law. It goes all the way up until really Moses, and then God says incest is bad. Why is that? Now, when we today have incest, it produces genetic malforms of other people. And so, but we got to remember, if we put ourselves all the way back to the garden where everything was perfect, they were kicked out and things were cursed. They were still close to what we would call is perfection. So they could, in a genetic way, they could involve incest and they could have offspring through incest and still produce non-genetic malfunctions of human bodies, right? So it's just that was okay. But as we get to Mount Sinai, we see that it is now going to be God forbids it and says that it is unclean and that we shouldn't do it. Also, people live longer, right? So we think of people today, you become 20, 30 years old, you can have children, and then your children start to have children at 20, 30 years old, and their children start to have children at 20, 30 years old. But when Adam lives for 930 years, you can imagine all of the descendants that he has. It is almost feasible, if you read the timeline of chapter 5, that Noah could have known one of Adam's children. Like it's that far. And so a lot of people in a short amount of time. And so you keep reading, it talks about all these people, begatting, family tree, they're having kids. But notice verse 21, it says, when Enoch had lived 65 years, he fathered Methuselah. Now, Enoch is interesting. We see his name throughout the Bible. In the New Testament, we read his name several times. But what's interesting is in the book of Jude, verse 14, it tells us that Enoch was a prophet. He was a prophet of God. So even in the Old Testament, Enoch knew of God and he knew and preached about the Messiah. So this is an interesting point. But it also says that Enoch walked with God. It shows us the relationship. So even though the world is going and we see Cain building the city and doing all these things that are not good, we can see that there are still people who are good and who want to be with God. Verse 20, let's see, verse 27, then all the days of Methuselah were 969 years. That is the longest person in the Bible to live, 960 years. Can you imagine that? What's interesting is Methuselah was born and he lasted all the way up until the flood, right? So it's interesting. His father, Enoch, and so that just shows you, once again, the grace of God, allowing people to live, to do his will, to populate the earth, but to live long so that they might accept the goodness and the glory of God. Notice verse 31, it says, thus the days of Lamech were 770 years and he died. If you read chapter 5, there's a lot of people that lives, but the word that keeps repeating is he died, he died, he died, he died, he died. The theme of chapter 5 is that people die. Since Genesis chapter 3, since them being kicked out of the garden, death has entered. And now we start to see that. And we will see that as we continue to read the whole Bible, that every single person will die. In verse 32, after Noah was 500 years, he fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth, setting us up for the next chapter. But when you read this, you ask yourself, where is Jesus in this genealogy, right? Well, where's the point? Let me point back to verse 24. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Enoch did not die, but God took him. God took his body and brought it up to heaven. This is what we would call a prophecy, a shadow of what to come, that one day Jesus Christ will not die, but he will in bodily form ascend to the Father. So we see, once again, in the very early pages of Genesis, we can see the echoes of the Gospels of them telling us, Mark chapter 16, that Jesus bodily ascended to the right hand of the Father, just like Enoch. Hope this makes sense, and we'll see you tomorrow in Genesis chapter 6. God bless.